I would like to invite folks, if you are joining us, that you can access captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen to view captions. We also have interpretation available on screen. If you are having trouble accessing our interpretation or captioning, please let us know in the chat, and one of our team members will try to acknowledge and address the issue as quickly as possible to make sure that folks are able to have full access. Hello, welcome to the next installment of our Liberating Webinar series. My name is Lydia XZ Brown, sign name L Brown. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair and glasses. I'm wearing a jade necklace and a black t-shirt that says Allegheny County. With a blurry room behind me. I'm the Director of Policy, Advocacy, and External Affairs for the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. And I'm really excited tonight to introduce to you our special guests for a fireside chat on disability justice and homelessness. I'd like to introduce our three special guests tonight for a fireside chat on disability justice and homelessness. First, I would like to introduce Angela Lemus-Mogrovejo. Angela is a 28-year-old disabled transgender woman of color working to make a stable life for herself in the Seattle area. Having written for online publications such as Rooted in Rights and worked as a freelance poet for the past 5 years, Angela now spends much of her time streaming and designing tabletop role-playing game materials, in addition to continuing her creative projects. Next, I'd like to introduce Finn Gardiner, a disability rights advocate with interests in educational equity, intersectional justice, comparative policy, and inclusive technology. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, and a bachelor's degree in sociology from Tufts University. He's currently the communications specialist at the Lurie, L-U-R-I-E, Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University, where he combines disability advocacy, policy analysis and research, and written and visual communications through policy briefs, original reports, white papers, and contributions to research projects. His research and advocacy interests include education and employment for autistic adults, comparative disability policy, inclusive technology, LGBTQ cultural competency, and policy that addresses intersections between disability, race, LGBTQ identities, class, and other experiences. In addition to his work at Brandeis, Finn also serves as a member of the board of directors at the Human Services Research Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to research and policy advocacy benefiting people with disabilities and seniors. And last, but absolutely not least, I would like to introduce Allilsa Fernandez, a mental health, disability activist, and consultant. They have worked with companies such as Lionsgate, Facebook, and Verizon, and he has volunteered for Sylvia Rivera Law Project to work on TGNC, transgender and gender nonconforming, shelter organizing, and Met Council on housing justice. Thank you so much, Allilsa, Angela, and Finn, for joining us this evening, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, so we're here to talk about disability and homelessness and how systemic discrimination against disabled folks affects people who are homeless or who are at risk of homelessness or who have dealt with it themselves, and how we as advocates and community members can help make the world a more just place for people who have experienced this. Actually, let me rephrase that. And so we're here to talk about how we can alleviate the stress and the trauma that disabled folks and homeless folks experience, and how we can, well, first of all, we should eliminate homelessness altogether, but that's a process. And in the meantime, we're going to have to find out, what is it like and how can we fix things?
This is Angela speaking. I would be happy to pick up from where Finn's been going. In sort of trying to address matters, the various issues that come up in relation to the stresses of homelessness and such, I would say even just one of the first points pulling from my own personal experience is actually even realizing when you count as homeless, because various, whether you're looking from a state level or even just a shelter to shelter kind of level, or if you're looking in something such as more like federal policy in relation to like SNAPs and such, I did not realize for about a 6 to 9 month period that I fit the category of homeless until I actually tried to apply for SNAP benefits. And then I had a distinct memory of my partner helping me fill out the forms and being like, oh, hon, do I count as homeless? I didn't think I did because I had a place to stay. I just didn't have anywhere long term and was being what I like to sardonically refer to as being punted around the Bay Area.
Yeah, I went through that too. Right down to being in the Bay Area back in like 2006 when I had just become homeless. And because I thought of being homeless as living in a shelter or being street homeless as opposed to couch surfing. And I was doing a lot of couch surfing for quite some time.
This is Angela speaking again. There was very much a time for me where that was the case, where even just like subletting, when I would have maybe a month max finding a spot, it became almost like a hustle of figuring out, like, if you applied a certain date for housing, you were doomed. You weren't, the likelihood of missing your chance to even get another sublet space to stay was not going to work out for you. And part of what kind of compounded that those difficulties were also just trying to sort out where I fit in terms of resources, because specifically for the age I was, which was 22, fresh out of college, but having nowhere to stay, the kinds of resources that were available for youth, more broadly speaking, seemed to cap off right about at the age that I was. And then the awkwardness of 21 to 25 age range became a case of, well, you're kind of an adult, so you should have a sense of what you can do, or maybe you don't, but we don't want to give you resources. There was an awkwardness around it. Like, I remember the closest location that I had for when I finally secured a much more long-term and a much more stable living situation was an LGBTQ center that capped off at about age 23. And really the only thing they could help me with was maybe resume writing and nothing really else beyond that, because the other resources were much more designed for 13 through like 20 age range.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good point, Angela. How people view homelessness. It's often street homelessness, or they've completely lost their apartment, but they don't think about going into their aunt's house or uncle's house, or couch surfing, or sleeping in the library. So homelessness looks so many different ways. And the same thing with attire, someone can be dressed up with a tie and shirt and still be homeless. you never know, homeless is the word, homeless. That doesn't have a permanent address, that's all. And speaking about resources, I know I personally enter a shelter and I identify as LGBTQ, as queer. And the resources are very very cisgender. And they have this setup like, here's men's clothes and here's women's clothes, and it marks them, And so many people that work there were like, here's the woman's clothes. Come and check out the woman's clothes. Do you need this skirt? Do you need this dress? I'm like, I don't want that. That's not what I wear. That's not who I am, And it's very, very cisgender. And then when you're going to look for jobs, the same thing. The resources that are given to you are very cisgender, very straight. And that's important because as a queer person, I need a job to understand my identities. I need safety. The way that folks work with me because of the clothing too, I need to make sure I'm coming into a safe space that allows me to dress how I want to dress, not how they identify me as and how they want to dress me. I'm also non-binary, and I had to find my own way. I found a great workforce in Manhattan, in New York City. The name slips right now, but it was LGBTQ center, and it was awesome because I came in as myself. The resources were non-binary, like it didn't really have a gender. They were more open. Another thing with when it comes to resources is food. I remember going to get food in the local pantry. The pantry was maybe like 3 blocks away from the shelter. And even though I got there first, this lady was like, no. This other person goes first. And this other person goes first. And this other person goes first. And I'm like, what the heck? And it took another lady being there to call out that lady giving out food and say, what are you doing? The only reason why you're not giving this person food is because they don't appear straight, because they're different looking than the rest of us. Give them their food. And this is why resources matters. Resources that are LGBTQ center and trans and gender nonconforming center, because there's so much discrimination. There's always that person, if you want to get a job, you need to accept Jesus. Nobody wants to give someone like you a job. We need to pray for you, repent from your sin. All of these very discriminating things that's just like, what the heck? So having our own space is very important. Having the shelters that really accept us is important. I won't speak for my friends, but I do have friends that enter the shelter system and faced violence just because they were transgender. So there, for our community, is very unsafe. And now you add disability to that. Oh my God.
This is Finn. Allilsa, I want to add, yeah, that was absolutely my experience in the shelter system. And like you mentioned, things like the clothing closets and the job skills programs, the shelters themselves. You have men's shelters, women's shelters, men's section, women's section. And even in places that are supposedly progressive, like San Francisco, if you're trans or gender nonconforming, you are highly likely to experience discrimination. That was the case for me back in like 2008, like around 2008, 2009. I'm a trans man, and back then I was not generally perceived as a man as I am now, because this is before I started, doing, physical transition. And although the shelter formally recognized my gender identity, I was put in the men's section, and nobody told me to get women's clothes, the clothing line. People kept misgendering me. I kept dealing with harassment by other clients. And sadly enough, a lot of them were people of color. So I was being harassed by other clients. Luckily, no physical violence happened, but I definitely dealt with a lot of bullying and verbal abuse. I dealt with a lot of, I felt isolated. I was, it was really, really difficult for me to get my bearings, and I was often blamed if I got upset or melted down because yet another person was bullying me over my gender identity. Like, it was all like, oh, you need to control your emotions. You need to. So like, why don't you stop these people from harassing me? Like, why don't you stop these people from harassing me? And then on top of that, there was a lot of disability discrimination as well. So I was staying in a youth shelter that had about maybe 40, 50 people in it in San Francisco. And during the day, they made everybody go out to, find jobs or just to get out of the staff's hair. And I could not deal with that every day. I was just constantly forced to go out every day and deal with this harassment and deal with this transphobia and deal with regular street harassment. And there weren't a lot of programs that you could go to during the day if you didn't have a job, and there was limited access to computers. It was difficult. It's like, how do you even find a job if you don't have the tools to get a job? And then, as you mentioned, Jill, so like there are all these programs that are religious, and a lot, not that the problem is the religion, but these people use religion to discriminate against LGBTQIA folks. And a lot of people become homeless because they left homophobic family or transphobic family. Like, that's what happened to me. Like, I left I ran away from my parents at the age of 20 years old. I mean, at the age of 20, to get away from my extremely abusive, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and generally awful parents. I had to run away from that. And then I come to San Francisco and have to see more of that. It's like, wait, and there were laws in place. The stuff that was going on in the shelter, the discrimination I was experiencing from some of these staff members was illegal under state and local law. And I filed God knows how many grievance forms against staff, both in the shelter and in the group home that was operated by the same organization. What it was often about, it was either about gender identity or disability every time. And on top of that, there were also a lot of racial tensions, where you had a lot of administration there was a lot of this condescending attitude from a lot of, I gotta say this, white staff members who thought that they knew better than people of color. And then you had a lot of tension between different ethnic and cultural groups, because you had all these people just jammed into one space with no real thought about how they were going to get along or how to mediate conflict. And I saw so much xenophobia against Latinx people who were undocumented. I saw discrimination against, I saw Black youth being mistreated. I saw low expectations being applied to youth of color. I saw that, for example, Black youth would get, even if Black people were serving as staff in the shelter or group home, Black people would be put out more often, because they at the shelter and in the group home, one of the punishments they had was to kick people out if they violated too many shelter or group home rules. It's like, why are you, like, so if people aren't doing the right thing, you throw them back out in the street again? It's like, that's ridiculous. That's awful. And I remember complaining about it. And so a lot of times the people get kicked out overnight, Black or Latinx. I don't remember seeing any, when I was staying at the group home, I don't remember many white clients getting kicked out overnight. They were usually Black, often Black men, but they were usually Black. And whereas the white residents, I don't remember any white resident getting the same scrutiny that Black residents got. And it's just frustrating. And then, and I remember, and of course, as I said, there was also ableism. And I remember being told point blank by my case manager in my group home that this is not a program for people with disabilities. I was literally told that. Never mind that as an organization, they were bound by the ADA. And that, what she said, was grounds for a lawsuit. But at the time, I was young. I was like 23 years old, homeless. I didn't think I had much power. And they also, and I was like forced to go out for like 8 hours, 8 hours a day, and dealing with all the sensory overload and the harassment. And then like, oh, they cut it down to 4 hours, but they couldn't get rid of it. Oh, because that's the program rules. And it's like, why? This is a program. I'm thinking, wait a second, that's not accessible. I can't benefit from the program if you're just re-traumatizing me all the time. I need to be able to look for jobs, but there are no activities. There is no structure. I can't just make my own structure when I'm under this much stress, when I have PTSD, when I have all these other things going on. And it's like, oh, well, everyone else has to do it. Well, guess what? Everyone else may not be autistic. And guess what? Everyone else shouldn't be forced to leave the building all the time either. And being allowed to stay in was a reward you could get if you had a job. But if you didn't have a job, they made you go out. It's like, what if you can't get a job what if you need a computer to get a job? What if you can't just get a job where they have paper applications? And honestly, most jobs, even back in 2009, they didn't have paper applications. You had to go online to apply for a job. Like if you ask for a paper application, go online. But if you have no access to a computer, how are you going to apply for a job? And the library, the San Francisco Public Library, some days they didn't even open until noon, but they'd kick you out at 9. So for 3 hours, you'd wander around aimlessly with nothing to do. It's like, what do you like? And it's like, you wonder why people don't get rehoused. You wonder why there's so much recidivism. You wonder why people don't end up getting the help they need. Oh, because they're being kicked out all day with nothing to do and no help and no resources, just being left adrift. That is ableist in itself. That is racist. That is homophobic. That is transphobic. Just exposing those clients to yet more trauma, to yet more discrimination, and giving them nothing.
This is Allilsa. Then you hit the nail. That's exactly it. I personally have entered I'll just say domestic violence shelters. This is supposed to be a place where you don't get traumatized. You're supposed to leave the trauma, start the healing process. And that's far from the truth. And even entering, I've also been in just a shelter because the same thing. I had to leave my home. I was queer. My mom didn't accept it. And long story short, I ended up in a shelter. And same thing, it's so traumatic. It's so traumatic. The point that you're homeless and you're in a shelter, that in itself is traumatic, but then the way that the staff treats you is so traumatic. I had one staff gave me one roll of toilet paper. This is like 40 cents. I didn't have 40 cents. But the shelter gets paid. What a lot of people don't know is the shelter makes $3,000 to $5,000 per night per person. That's a lot of money. So toilet paper should be the least of their worries. And she gave me the toilet paper. She said, you're supposed to buy this. I'm like, oh, I've just applied for the benefits. It hasn't kicked in. Well, that's what you're supposed to do. I said, if I had a condition and I had to use the toilet for a longer period of time, specifically diarrhea, what's going to happen? How do I come back down here and ask for another roll of toilet paper? That's inhumane. That is inhumane. But that's not the only lack of access. Like being in a shelter, I saw only certain people get fed because they don't have options of food. So if you have a certain condition, you can't eat certain things. I personally saw folks ask for it. They were not given that food. They were not accommodating, even though they're supposed to follow the ADA. That's how I got involved with Silver Rivera Law Project, because I just saw and experienced so much injustice myself and saw so many people around me experience so many injustices. I decided to get more involved. And when I got involved, there was a town hall meeting, and the people that reported the same problem, elevators being down. So if you had a condition, you couldn't get to your floor. And folks in the shelter had to carry the people upstairs. Not staff, the community. If not, you were just stuck in your room for however long it took to fix the elevator. Sometimes it was out for a month to 2 months. Okay. Getting food, lack of accessibility. It turns out in New York City, only 2 shelters have an accessible intake. So if you have to use a wheelchair, you know what the shelter tells you? Go to a nursing home. That's what they tell you. You're going to go into an institution, another institution, that's even more careless because there's no accessibility. And just recently here in New York City, there was a lawsuit because of that, the lack of accessibility. And things haven't changed since that lawsuit, which has been like 2 or 3 years. I sat down with the Department of Homelessness. They haven't changed much. And it still continues. So for people with disabilities at different intersections, it's even worse. And then as Finn said, most of the people being kicked out from shelters are Black and brown folks, more so Black people. And it's because shelters criminalize what they call, quote, quote, bad behavior, but it's a mental health crisis. They don't want to deal with mental health. I remember the director of one of the shelters saying, if you're going to have a bout, you need to get out. And the person had bipolar, was diagnosed with bipolar. And that's what they do. They don't want anyone that requires medication or that they need to accommodate. It's still very discriminating. It's something that I wonder why the disability community, the disability rights community as a whole doesn't talk much about it, because it really does affect people with disabilities in so many ways. And then we get into the shelters having mold and broken windows, broken beds, bed bugs, all of that leads to disability. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, and there's just so much to go over that of the intersection of disability and homelessness.
This is Angela talking. The other thing that comes to mind, sort of integrating what both Finn and Allilsa have said, is also kind of what I'm hearing is a severe lack of even training or even understanding from a basic level from a care provider perspective. And I use care provider more loosely to include even just the folks who are like youth advocates, program managers, shelter site coordinators, things of that sort. I recall working for 2 different nonprofits who were basically acting as some among their services were shelter services. One was over in San Francisco and the other one was in Seattle about a year or 2 ago. And honestly, I remember something that I said, I believe it was at the 25th anniversary of the ADA being signed, that I was lucky enough to speak on a panel of for, I think it was Generation ADA or something of that sort. I remember saying that, like, with folks celebrating the ADA providing so much access and things of that sort, I didn't want to be the cynic or the person like being rain on a nice day of everyone celebrating something, but it was a very palpable sense of I don't feel any of that understanding or knowledge or even basic understanding being implemented on some of the groundwork level, even something like a shelter. I worked with youth where I don't even recall any part of my training for interacting with youth who were at an LGBTQ youth shelter who were homeless around anything disability related. I think I was more bringing in perspectives around that with my limited understanding with both personal experience and what I'd studied and also how it worked in another shelter before. And I remember working in a men's shelter in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco, where I don't recall a single bit of my training materials having anything related to the ADA outside of like a sign on the wall related to it that was just the actual bare text of the law itself in
This is the Fell
tiny
Street. What's the Fell Street shelter?
hospitality house. I don't mind bringing them because I didn't work with them.
I've heard of them. I've heard of them. Yeah, I was involved with Larkin Street Youth, so that's my experience.
I heard about them. But it feels as though there's a distinct, both from just the experiences we talked about and also as general patterns, a distinct lack of even baseline understandings of disability applied in homeless context. And for me, a lot of my experience comes from in a youth context, working with LGBTQ youth who are dealing with homelessness, because I saw those inequalities coming up in terms of how skewed the perspective was around how people were being treated. We had a client who was very, very terrible to a lot of staff, who I think they'd run through like 3 or 4 different people as a result of that one person. They were white. They had been given multiple different chances that I got the impression 1 or 2 of the other clients who were brown or black were not getting that same level of understanding or care in engagement. And I remember having someone come during one of the evenings to the office in the back to speak to me specifically, that I could tell it was probably because I was brown, and they felt safer than the white resource coordinator who they had tensions with. They confessed having a lot of tensions and disagreements with during the day. And there seemed to be a sense of hostility towards a lot of clients as well, of like they're not trying hard enough, but precisely for the kinds of things that you brought up, Finn, that it was like, well, some of it might be them not trying, but more than likely, even if we're going to validate that perspective, which has problems with it as a baseline, what are they supposed to do when they're being kicked out of the only shelter, especially during here in Seattle in particular, one of the worst winters we had in recent memory? Folks needed to stay warm. Folks needed to not be dealing with snow and outside for like 8 hours. And it's kind of difficult. It's kind of difficult to try and justify any nature of that situation being remotely understanding of disability.
This is Allilsa. And the thing is, they're making $3,000 to $5,000 a night from people. If they had subsidized housing, it's only like $1,200. But the government, they rather pay for shelter for people to live in these abusive, humiliating, degrading, traumatizing situations and settings, and then pay for housing. Out here, we had a big issue in New York City with getting CityFab approved for housing market value, meaning if the rent for one apartment is $1,200, that's what the subsidized voucher should be for. But they were only giving folks like $200 or $500.
In New York?
Yes, in New York, exactly.
It's a place where the rent is too damn high in New York.
Yes.
That's ridiculous. That's
Yes.
ridiculous.
Yes, exactly. We even have a chant that says, "Cause the rent is too damn high."
Yeah, I was thinking of that. Yeah, it's absurd, and it's just, yeah, and the thing is, like, and they do the same thing with people with disabilities in general, where Medicaid will cover the cost of an institutional placement. So they'll put you in a nursing home, but to get home and community-based services, you have to go through all these hoops. You're on these long waiting lists. In the state of Georgia, there were like there was a documentary called a 6,000 Waiting that was all about these that kind of profiled these folks. There were 4 people. One was a parent, the other 3 were self-advocates, and all 4 of these people were on this waiting list, like 6,000 people on it, to get services in their home as opposed to being put in an institution. Now, some of them did get services. There's one of those people, he's still in an institution, even though this guy has been on a documentary, and his plight has been highlighted, and televised, not televised, but like recorded, and he is still in an institution. And it's the same thing in other states. So we have these laws, and then we have like a Supreme Court ruling that says that people with disabilities have the right to live in the community, Olmstead versus LC, but we haven't been able to fulfill the promise of Olmstead. And a lot of homeless people have disabilities. A lot of homeless people have psychiatric disabilities, whether they're diagnosed or not. And some people may have other disabilities as well. For example, substance use disorders, or some of them may be autistic or have ADHD. I think a lot of people who are homeless are probably disabled in some way. And if they're not, they're going to get a disability from being traumatized all the time by living in those places, especially for a long period of time. I went into the shelter, when I went into that, when I stayed in that shelter that I mentioned earlier, I was autistic, I had PTSD, anxiety, depression, and, dissociation, and it was, a nightmare. And I was not getting the support I needed, despite being entitled to those supports under law. And it was an uphill battle for me to be able to live in the community, even though I wasn't staying in an institution that was geared toward people with disabilities. I still had to deal with a lot of this institutional bias, where instead of doing rapid rehousing or doing housing first, there's a lot of research out there saying that housing first programs, in which homeless people are put straight into long-term housing with extensive support networks, they put you in a congregate setting and you have to fight and claw your way out. And you go on the Section 8 waiting list, you're on there for 10 years. You try to get housing vouchers, they give you only a few $100s in New York, where the rent is absurd. And they just let you fend for yourself. It's like Lord of the Flies. And the thing is, as you said, Angela, the government can save a ton of money by using housing first programs. There's a body of research out there from the United States and from other countries saying that housing first works, just as home and community-based services work for people with disabilities in general. And yet you still have people being thrown into these institutions because they think it's cheaper, or because they think it will dissuade us from needing it. It's like it's a very punitive model of social support, where they it's like, oh, we want to make sure you get a job and participate properly in capitalist society, so we're going to make this as unpleasant as possible so you get out and get a job. When that's not, like, you're not even helping anyone get a job. You assume that people will just go out there and get an instant job. And especially, when there's a recession going on, because I was in that shelter in 2008 during the Great Recession, and they still expected me to run out and find a job like that. And they'll just make it even harder and harder. Like in the group home I was staying in, the director actually said that, oh, we're going to start kicking people out who aren't working and who are just living on benefits. So it's like, oh, you can't even live in this group home if you're on benefits. What? They're homeless. How do you expect them to have a job already?
Yeah, this is Allilsa. Out here in New York City, there was a report that came out. So people apply for subsidized housing. And here's where ableism kicks in. For a lot of people with disabilities, they'll apply for what's called supportive housing. And guess what? The report showed, this was just this past year. What the report showed, this was an organization out here, Urban Justice. They went through FOIL and they got the paperwork of why people were denied. And here's some of the things and some of the reasons, sorry, why people were denied. That person smelled bad. That person didn't behave accordingly. That person spoke too fast. That person looks like they will cause a tantrum. That person looks like they will be chaotic. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, this is supposed to be a program that's supposed to be supportive of people with disabilities. But the reason folks are denied housing are because of their disabilities. Make it make sense. So the programs that exist to support people who are homeless at the intersection of disability, they're not even being utilized because they find discriminatory ways to go around to just say, I don't want this person in my apartment. And it's just horrible.
Sort of keeping us on track in relation to time, because we are reaching the end of the time that we have together. Unfortunately, despite all three of us having a lot of different things, a lot of very intense opinions that are warranted, especially given the nature of what all of us have experienced. It sounds like, at least from what I've been getting in terms of everyone talking and giving both personal experiences and talking to policy and such, that part of the overall issue that, at least how I am seeing it, that all three of us are touching on, is that even the programs we have currently that are supposed to be being used have a fundamental underlying issue with looking for the appropriate lives to continue like supporting and having and being livable. There's only certain kinds of livable lives for folks who have who deal with multiple strands of oppression or structural restrictions, where we are allowed to actually exist. And that ultimately is inadequate and unjust for what I think anything even remotely relating to a decent and fair world is for disabled folk of all stripes, but especially folks who are living at the intersection of multiple forms of existence and ways of being in the world. Like, we really got to stop holding on to this idea that there's certain kinds of folk who are going to be agreeable for just resource use in general. And also, as Finn, as you've pointed out, we really have to stop with this sort of idea that somehow the stick and the whole carrot and stick metaphor is going to ever be useful to folks. It's not. It's been proven for years. We're not getting anywhere with being punishment minded and punitive minded. None of that has really been helpful. At this point, we have to actually give a damn about each other and care about one another from not only an interpersonal standpoint, but also from a policy standpoint. Because right now we are not supporting the people who really need the help. Hell, we're not even supporting the people who are making use of it very well either.
This is Allilsa. As we wrap up, I want to end on some things that we can do. They are effective. And they were effective for me. And I honestly can say that, like, oh my God, it makes me emotional just thinking about that. That those were the things that were very supportive for me, very helpful for me, is having community. You know, I had folks who donated money so I can get a cup of coffee. So even though the rest of the world was falling apart for me, I had a cup of coffee. I have folks who helped me with my resume, community members. I have folks who helped me find clothes that were fitting for me. And now that I'm in a better position, I do that for others. So community, having that community. So if you have clothes that are not stained or with holes, donating them, consider donating your time, helping someone else with their resume, with job seeking, applying for housing. That's not going to solve the problem entirely, but it is supportive and it does help in some ways.
This is Lydia. I want to thank all of you, Allilsa, Angela, Finn, for joining us today and for this conversation. I know that there are literally a million more things that our community needs to reckon with in dealing with the grave racial and disability injustice of homelessness. And I'm really grateful for the work that each of you is doing to galvanize and push our communities to take accountability for their failures and for where our communities and our leaders have not actually done anything meaningfully to address housing injustice as a form of racial injustice, as a form of disability injustice. I also appreciate your raising so many critical issues for queer and trans disabled folks of color facing homelessness, because we know that our communities just face higher rates of abuse, of harm, of homelessness, and of unemployment than people who come from white and wealth privileged and non-disabled communities and folks that are cisgender and heterosexual. We know that, we know that, but a lot of folks who aren't part of our communities and conversations don't necessarily have a consciousness of those realities. So I appreciate you raising that. And I am hopeful that you and others will join us for our transition to live Q&A and for the continuation of our series on liberating webinars for our next installments, as well as for our continued programming in the new year. And thank you again to MJ, our interpreter, to Nancy, AWN's Programs and Education Assistant, and to everyone who works so hard to put our webinars together. And now we'll transition to live Q&A. So if you have not yet, please make sure to add your questions into the chat and we will read and share them. This is Lydia. I'd like to invite our guests back on camera. We've got a couple of questions that have come in over the last hour. So I'm gonna ask the first question is from Elena Pruett, P-R-U-E-T-T, Federline, F-I-E-D-E-R-L-E-I-N. Elena said, I appreciate so much all of you sharing your experiences. I'm a law student in Virginia, and I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts related to homelessness in rural areas. I think often it's assumed that homelessness is a primarily urban problem, but in my experience growing up in rural Virginia, there's homelessness here as well. And some of the problems with ableism are exacerbated by the lack of reliable transportation and the general sparseness of available resources. Homelessness in rural areas also tends to be less visible, which I think means it can be harder to organize and reach people. Do any of y'all have experience of this or any thoughts about how to better meet the needs of disabled folks experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness in rural areas? Finn, it looks like you came off mute.
Oh, I did. That is a very good question. I have lived in suburban and quasi-rural areas before, and honestly, I think that a lot of people, especially young people who are homeless and lived in rural areas, end up hitchhiking or going to urban areas anyway. They end up just leaving because they know there are no resources now. But if they stay, I imagine that it would be harder because, you know, as you said, there's no public transit. There may not even be a shelter in town. You may have to go to a nearby city anyway, or you may be dependent on family, and there might be a lot of couch surfing going on and a lot of invisible homelessness as opposed to the more visible street homelessness. But again, my experience is with urban homelessness. So most of this is speculation or what I've encountered from meeting people who were originally from rural areas who ended up in cities. Some of the clients in the group home in which I was staying originally came from rural areas. They came from the Midwest or the South and ended up traveling out to San Francisco to get support.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing that, Finn. Allilsa or Angela, did either of you want to add to that?
This is Allilsa. I would say similar experiences to Finn. I have my personal experience are urban, but I have worked closely with shelters in rural areas and some folks who did struggle and were homeless in rural areas. But just like Finn said, they travel out most of the times. They're not going to stay there. And if they did stay in rural areas, they mostly lived in dorms with someone else, couch surfed, slept in libraries. It's not really as easy to go to a shelter, especially if it's not accessible, which there's that question too. Shelters being inaccessible even more so than urban areas. And we're already, and I said in New York City, there's only 2 that are accessible. So imagine. So it's easier to stay with friends, with family, places that can be accessible rather than shelters.
This is Lydia. Thank you, Allilsa. Angela, did you want to add to that, or do you just want to move to the next question?
I would say move to the next question. Again, my personal experiences are very urban based, so I would not want to give any particular insights that would not be helpful or productive to the conversation. So I think moving on from me at least would be most appropriate.
This is Lydia. We did receive a message from Amara, A-M-A-R-A, Simmons, in response to that question from Elena, and asked if that would be possible to weigh in and share. So I will share that. Amara said, I worked as a CNA, certified nurse assistant, at a detox center in Fairbanks, Alaska, which compared to metropolitan areas like Seattle, for instance, where I live now, is fairly rural, for 7 years, and thus got to know many homeless folks. They would come to the detox center intoxicated oftentimes because the only place else to stay was associated with Salvation Army or rescue mission. And I think we all know about Salvation Army's abusive and bigoted policies. Rescue mission was similar, made people work to stay there, go to Alcoholics Anonymous, church, etc. On top of that, there were 0 shelters in Fairbanks that accepted intoxicated people. So the only option was getting admitted to detox or being sent to jail for the night. I have a lot to say about all of the things I saw and around the experiences I know of loved ones and what I learned about the programs or desperate lack thereof in the area. I'd be happy to connect more about any of this. And Amara shared contact information, which you could reshare so that folks could access that if you wanted to do that. Thank you, Amara, for sharing. Our next question comes from Jenny, Jennie MK. Jenny says, how do we begin to undo the punitive ways that society treats intersectional homelessness and create structures that truly love and help people in need? I know fundraising and then going through the steps and applying it is used in a short-term transitional plan. I am an intensely intersectional person in a highly dysfunctional Oregon and would love for you to weigh in that way, please.
This is Allilsa. So I have some extensive experience around this topic. So I'll share from that lens. So yeah, short-term fundraising, but also COVID has shown us mutual aid. So gathering together. So if you know, for example, folks are going to be evicted, that's the time to intervene, not waiting until homelessness, or if someone's feeling uncomfortable with their family members because they're homophobic or transphobic, offering spaces that are safe to stay, that are not shelters. Those are short-term ways. But long-term, I think that the answer is going to be something that's already taking place. We've seen it in Philadelphia as COVID hit, and we've seen it. I think the mothers were from Georgia, but I might be mistaken. But it's I forget their names. It's Mothers something, and there were a group of Black mothers that did a phenomenal job. But what I've seen between those two organizing, on the ground organizing, sorry, it slipped my mind. Those on the ground organizing was that they bought the house. So teaming up together to buy the property, to buy the land, and then having folks share. And it's a long discussion. I won't get into a lot of details because there's so much to discuss, but there also has to be guidance to that so people can't resell it for a higher price. There's a discussion going on how to do it that it stays within the community and it's communal. And then this way landlords don't jack up the prices and we can stay within the community. And then the last thing I would say is that Leroy mentioned this before too. It might not be the long-term solution, but something that we all can do is advocating for subsidized housing. So just this year, New York City passed City FEP at a market rate, which means that folks now are paid, let's say that the rent is $1,200 for one bedroom. That's what they're going to receive instead of prior months where they were just getting $200 or $300 for $1,200 apartment. That's absurd. They can't meet the rent. So that's something that folks can do meanwhile. But I think long term is buying property and land and then keeping it in the community. Sorry, this is Allilsa. One thing I did wanted to say is we have to have these conversations. Intersection of folks with disabilities, with the people making housing decisions. I have been a part of the panels with folks, and 99% of them are white, cis, straight. So because we're not in the room, we're left out of the decision making. So I just wanted to leave with that.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing all of that, Allilsa. I love community efforts to take back land and to share that so that more people can have housing. And also the kind of fuckery you're describing of, panels of the supposed experts who don't share any of our experiences, who've never experienced marginalization or oppression. I have a t-shirt. I wish I was wearing it today and I'm not. It says, "I am not a token." And I love to wear that to those kinds of events. Finn, I saw that you came off mute, so I'll turn to you.
Thank you. Oh my God, yes. Listen to us. You need to listen to us. You need to listen to people who have been there, who have gone through homelessness, who have experienced homophobia and transphobia and racism and ableism and other kinds of discrimination. Many of these people who are coming in as outsiders, like the white folks on the panel that Allilsa mentioned, a lot of them mean well. They really want to help. But if they don't understand what we've gone through, they can sometimes make assumptions or rely on assumptions that they had before and be kind of paternalistic. They may say, "Oh, we know what's best for you, so we're going to come in and teach you personal responsibility." And so they often use this structure called the continuum of care, in which homeless people are led through a series of steps toward independence, and you have to follow that particular path. And so you start in from the street, they do an intake, and then you stay in a shelter where there are lots of rules, and they're often inaccessible, and there's often violence and discrimination and God knows how many other terrible things. But after you run the gauntlet at the shelter, then you can progress to a group home, and then maybe they'll give you enough money to get set up at an apartment. And while you're there, they're going to push you to get a job as soon as possible. And unfortunately, the jobs that you can get quickly may not work for everyone. For example, there are people with disabilities who may do well in an office job, or who may do well in jobs that are creative, but they are not well suited to retail or food service or any of these other jobs that are relatively easy to get. Also, those jobs tend not to have benefits. They tend to be inaccessible. They tend to require you to lift heavy things and be on your feet all day. And so these are jobs that are they're difficult for anyone. But if you have a disability, it's even harder. For example, I'm autistic. I can't deal with constant noise and interruptions and highly circumscribed workplaces that don't give me much autonomy. Now, I know some autistic people who are more linear who may be fine with that, but that's not how my brain works. And I could not get any of those jobs. And when I first became homeless, I even tried to get those jobs, even though I knew I couldn't do them, because I wanted to be able to support myself, but I couldn't get a job at all. It took me years to be able to get a job. And that was after working with case managers and people working for the homeless youth organization that I was a client of, that helped people get back into school and get to work. And so I needed help. And a lot of times they don't help you. They just throw you out. Oh, get a job. It's like, wait a second. What if they don't even have job skills? What if they're so young, they've never even had the opportunity to have a job? But they think, oh, work will improve you. It's the whole Protestant work ethic. Work will improve you. It will make you a contributing member of society. If you don't work, then you don't contribute, which is bullshit. But a lot of people think that, especially if they have never if they've never encountered the indignity of being homeless, of having to lie outside at night, and sleeping on a bench, and then being splashed by sprinklers at 5 o'clock in the morning. They've never had to wander around town all day trying to get access to a computer where they can look for jobs, where they've never had to go to the library and have computers that you can have for only 15 minutes. And you can't look for a job with 15 minutes of computer time. You know how long those online job applications take? You know how many questions they ask you? You can't do that in 15 minutes, especially if you read slowly or you're not a native speaker of English. And the jobs that don't use those application forms tend to be higher level jobs. But a lot of the jobs that are relatively easy to get are those retail and food service jobs, and most of them use those online applications, and those are not quick to fill out. And they don't know how it feels to be discriminated against for being trans or gay or bi or Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American. They don't understand that. And so they come up with all these solutions that don't match the reality that we've lived. And when you presume that when you're presumptuous like that, when you claim to know someone better than they know themselves, that is extremely discriminatory, even if they may not realize it. And there's an entire body of research about, this is kind of a fancy academic term, epistemic injustice. As I said, it's a fancy term. It just means that marginalized people are devalued for their knowledge about themselves, or the ways that they gather knowledge, or they're marginalized by not being given the opportunity to get that knowledge. And so the knowledge of people who have been homeless, who experience racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and classism and everything else, those people's knowledge is being devalued. And they're letting people who don't know how it feels run the show. And that leads you to the continuum of care, where you have to jump through all these hoops and manage to get out with your human dignity intact.
And this is a Jill, so I just wanted to mention the resources that I placed in the chat is Moms for Housing, which was a group of Black mothers who bought a vacant home. And then it's a deal district in Philadelphia where folks bought vacant homes as well.
This is Lydia. I am really excited about that. I've been following it on and off for a while. So thank you for sharing, and I hope folks will check it out. We do have one last quick question that I feel like we could just address in like a minute. This comes from Santiago Farahafet, Fadajafet, who says, do others think tiny houses or single resident occupancy or other super small housing spaces are offensive? So I want to take that quickly. I see Finn is nodding.
Oh, don't even get me started on SROs. A lot of those places are dumps. They are not safe. They are often run by extremely sketchy landlords. One of my closest friends lived in an SRO for a while, and he did not have a good experience, and I avoided SROs. Now, tiny houses, for some people that might work, but to think that that's a solution for everything, what if you don't have anywhere to build a tiny house? What if you're too big to fit in a tiny house? What if you have a wheelchair that won't fit in a tiny house, or a walker? I know that some people are really into tiny houses, and if that's what they want, then great. But that's not a universal solution. And SROs are not a solution for anyone, in my opinion. There's a reason why they're called crack hotels. And the same goes for, I don't know whether this is a problem elsewhere, but in San Francisco, there are a lot of underground landlords that have illegal units that are often like converted garages or old Victorian houses that are broken up into like 20 different units, and they jam a bunch of people in there. Now, and they break all kinds of health codes that way, but because the housing market is so saturated, the housing market is such a nightmare, people end up in those situations. That's what happened to me after I was no longer technically homeless in San Francisco. I mean, Section 8 would have taken 10 years, as I said in the video, and I needed somewhere to live, but I couldn't afford to get a decent apartment on my own. So I lived in these illegal units. And the problem with those is, because they're illegal, landlords may not maintain the place to the same standard that a normal unit would adhere to. And also a lot of paperwork from the government, for example, for food stamps or SNAP, or for cash assistance. A lot of these programs will require a landlord to sign off on them. But the landlord may not want to sign that paperwork because it's illegal. They don't want to get in trouble for operating an illegal unit. That happened to me. I was kicked off benefits because my landlord refused to sign the paperwork because I lived in an illegal converted garage. So I mean, it was a good thing that I had a paid internship, but I was still I was still cut off food stamps and cash assistance because my landlords would not sign the paperwork because they were afraid of getting in trouble.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing that. I'm seeing lots of fantastic conversation in the chat about other forms of paternalism and discrimination happening in saviory type nonprofits, folks talking about squatters organizing, and people outside the US in some countries have formed squatters unions. I hope that this conversation can continue. If Nancy, if you could drop all of our panelists' payment links again in the chat, I know that they would appreciate your support. Obviously, AWN, of course, appreciates folks' support as well. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. It has been a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Obviously not the fuckery, but the ability to be able to talk about it in community. And I want to thank again our interpreters, MJ and Jeremy, our captioner, and Nancy for all of their fantastic work in helping organize these webinars, and of course to our speakers tonight, Allilsa, Angela, and Finn. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and we hope you'll join us in just a few weeks in January for our next webinar on decolonization, climate justice, and disability justice. I'm going to end our stream, and thank you all for coming again, and hope to see you again in the new year.